Wasn't that hilarious? Mitchell kept asking everyone at the airport gate, his voice echoing with that familiar tone that made my stomach clench. I stood there watching him tell the story to complete strangers, gesturing wildly as he described his brilliant plan to abandon me in Rio de Janeiro. The laughter from his audience felt like needles in my skin, and I realized this wasn't just another one of his pranks. This was the moment everything would change. My name is Sandra Phillips. I'm 29 years old, and I've been married to Mitchell for 3 years. We live in Portland, Oregon, where I work as a graphic designer for North Peak Engineering. To most people, our marriage probably looks normal, maybe even enviable. Mitchell is charming, successful in his sales job at Valina Media, and always has a joke ready. But behind closed doors, his sense of humor has a cruel edge that I've learned to navigate like walking through a minefield. This trip to Brazil was supposed to be our second honeymoon, a chance to reconnect after months of tension. Mitchell had been particularly proud of booking everything himself, insisting on keeping the itinerary a surprise. "Trust me, babe," he'd said with that grin that used to make my heart skip, but now made me wary. "I've planned something you'll never forget." He was right about that, though not in the way either of us expected. The first few days in Rio had been magical. We'd visited Christ the Redeemer, walked along Copacabana Beach, and eaten at incredible restaurants overlooking the city. Mitchell had been attentive and sweet, the version of himself I'd fallen in love with. I'd started to hope that maybe we could get back to that place where his jokes were actually funny, instead of calculated to make me feel small. But on our 4th morning, something shifted. I woke up to find Mitchell already dressed, his suitcase packed and sitting by the door. "Change of plans," he announced cheerfully, not meeting my eyes. "I've got to head back early for a work emergency. You understand, right?" I didn't understand, but before I could ask questions, he was kissing my forehead and promising to send details about my return flight. "Just enjoy the rest of the vacation," he said. "Think of it as some Sandra time." The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded final. That was when I found the note he'd left on the nightstand. Written in his neat handwriting were the words that would haunt me for the next 10 days. "Surprise! Consider this payback for not laughing at my joke about your mother last week. Figure out how to get home on your own. It builds character. Love you." As I stood in that hotel room, holding the note with trembling hands, I felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't just a prank. This was Mitchell showing me exactly how little I meant to him. The pattern had started small, so gradually that I'd barely noticed it at first. During our dating years, Mitchell's pranks were harmless. Hiding my keys before an important meeting, telling me we were going to a fancy restaurant only to drive to a food truck. I'd laughed along, thinking it showed his playful side. Back then, his eyes would sparkle with genuine mischief, and he'd always reveal the joke quickly, wrapping me in his arms while we both giggled. But after our wedding, the pranks began to have an edge. He'd forget to tell me about dinner plans with his friends, leaving me cooking for 2 while he texted hours later, asking why I wasn't at the restaurant. He'd hide important mail, then act concerned when I panicked about missing bills. When I confronted him, he'd always have the same response. "It's just a joke, Sandra. Why can't you take a joke?" My friends had started to notice. Jennifer from work had pulled me aside after our last group dinner, her face creased with worry. "The way he talks to you sometimes," she'd said carefully. "It doesn't seem very funny." But Mitchell was always careful to be charming in public, saving his special brand of humor for private moments when there were no witnesses. The worst part was how he'd gaslight me afterward. When I'd get upset about his pranks, he'd flip the script, making me the villain for not appreciating his creativity. "I work so hard to keep things interesting in our marriage," he'd say, his voice taking on that wounded tone that made me feel guilty for objecting. Most women would be grateful to have a husband who still tries to surprise them. I'd started walking on eggshells, never sure when the next prank would come or how far he'd take it. Sleep became elusive as I'd lie awake wondering what I'd wake up to. Would my car keys be hidden? Would he have told people embarrassing stories about me and claim it was just sharing a funny anecdote? The constant vigilance was exhausting. Looking back, I could see how methodically he'd been conditioning me to accept his behavior. Each prank pushed the boundary a little further, and each time I stayed, I was tacitly agreeing that this was acceptable treatment. He'd trained me to doubt my own reactions, to question whether I was being too sensitive or lacking in humor. Now, sitting alone in a Rio hotel room with his cruel note in my hands, I understood that abandoning me in a foreign country wasn't an escalation. It was Mitchell revealing who he'd always been underneath the charm. The mask had finally slipped completely. I walked to the window and looked out at the bustling streets of Rio, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. But underneath the fear and hurt, something else was stirring. For the first time in months, Mitchell wasn't there to tell me how I should react to his behavior. I was free to feel angry without being told I was overreacting. I was free to think clearly without his voice in my head, reshaping my reality to fit his narrative. The note crumpled in my fist as I made a decision that would change everything. The first day alone was terrifying. I sat in the hotel lobby, trying to figure out how to extend my stay since Mitchell had apparently booked my return flight for the same day he'd left. My Portuguese was limited to obrigada and com licença, and every interaction felt like navigating a maze blindfolded. The hotel staff was kind but busy, and I felt the full weight of my helplessness pressing down on me. By the second day, something had shifted. I forced myself to venture out of the hotel, armed with a translation app and a determination I hadn't felt in years. That's when I met Carlos Martinez, a tour guide who was leading a small group of tourists past the hotel. He was explaining something about the local architecture in accented English when he noticed me standing uncertainly on the sidewalk, clearly lost. "Excuse me," he said, approaching with a warm smile that reached his dark eyes. "You look like you might need some help." I almost cried with relief. Carlos was maybe 35, with kind eyes and an easy laugh that had nothing cruel in it. When I explained my situation, carefully editing out the more humiliating details, his expression grew serious. "Your husband left you here alone." The disbelief in his voice was validating in a way I hadn't expected. "This is not acceptable behavior for any man." Carlos spoke about respect with such certainty, as if it was a basic requirement rather than something to be earned through perfect behavior. It was a revelation. He offered to help me navigate the city, and for the first time since Mitchell had left, I didn't feel completely powerless. Over the next few days, Carlos showed me a Rio I never would have seen trailing behind Mitchell's aggressive tourist schedule. We explored quiet neighborhoods where locals gathered for afternoon coffee. He taught me basic Portuguese phrases and laughed with me, not at me, when I mispronounced words. We visited small galleries and listened to street musicians, taking time to actually absorb the culture instead of rushing through it for social media photos. What struck me most was how Carlos asked for my opinion on everything. Which restaurant looked appealing? What kind of music did I want to hear? Did I prefer the bustling beaches or the quieter overlooks? After 3 years of Mitchell making every decision and then mocking me if I expressed different preferences, having someone genuinely care about my thoughts felt revolutionary. "You seem surprised when I ask what you want," Carlos observed on our 4th day together as we sat watching the sunset from Sugarloaf Mountain. "My husband usually just decides things," I admitted, then immediately felt disloyal for saying it. Carlos was quiet for a moment, watching the golden light play across the water. "A partnership should be 2 people choosing together," he said simply. "Not one person deciding for both." Back in my hotel room that night, my phone buzzed with another text from Mitchell. He'd been sending them sporadically, each one more bewildered than the last. The latest read, "Sandra, this joke has gone on long enough. I'm starting to get worried. Call me back." I stared at the message, realizing something crucial had shifted inside me. I wasn't ready to go home yet. By the 6th day, Mitchell's texts had taken on a different tone. What had started as casual check-ins were becoming increasingly frantic demands for contact. "Sandra, answer your phone," read one message. "This isn't funny anymore," said another. The irony wasn't lost on me. Suddenly Mitchell was the one who couldn't take a joke. I found myself analyzing each message with a clarity I hadn't possessed in years. Without his physical presence to manipulate my emotions, I could see his tactics laid bare. The progression from dismissive to concerned to angry followed the exact pattern he used when his pranks didn't get the reaction he wanted. First, he'd double down on the joke. Then he'd express fake worry to make me feel guilty. Finally, he'd get angry and blame me for ruining his fun. But this time, I wasn't there to be manipulated. Carlos and I had settled into an easy routine. Each morning, he'd meet me at the hotel with coffee and a new plan for the day. We'd visited museums where he'd translate the Portuguese descriptions, sharing stories about Brazilian history that brought the exhibits to life. We'd eaten at tiny family restaurants where the owners treated Carlos like a son and welcomed me with warm embraces despite our language barrier. "You're different than when I first met you," Carlos observed as we walked through the Santa Teresa neighborhood, admiring the colorful street art. "More yourself, I think?" He was right. Without Mitchell's constant commentary on my appearance, my opinions, and my reactions, I was rediscovering who Sandra actually was underneath the layers of accommodation and anxiety I'd built up. I laughed louder, spoke up more, and stopped second-guessing every word before it left my mouth. The shift wasn't lost on the people around us either. Vendors in the markets would smile and joke with me in broken English, treating me like a person rather than a tourist to be endured. Children playing in the streets would wave, and their mothers would nod approvingly when they saw how gently Carlos treated me. On the 7th day, Carlos suggested we visit a small beach town about an hour outside Rio. "It's where my family is from," he explained. "Very quiet, very peaceful. Good for thinking." The bus ride gave us time to talk without the distractions of sightseeing. Carlos told me about his ex-wife, a relationship that had ended amicably when they realized they wanted different lives. "She wanted to travel the world," he said. "I wanted to stay close to family. Neither of us was wrong, but we weren't right for each other." The maturity in his approach to relationships was striking. There was no bitterness, no jokes at his ex-wife's expense, no need to prove he'd been the victim. It was just honest acknowledgement that sometimes people aren't compatible, and that's nobody's fault. "What about you?" he asked gently. "Your marriage, it seems complicated?" I found myself telling him things I'd never said out loud. How Mitchell's pranks made me feel constantly on edge. How he'd convinced me that my reactions were the problem, not his behavior. How isolated I'd become because defending his actions to friends was exhausting, so I'd stopped sharing details about our relationship entirely. Carlos listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just letting me talk. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "This is not love," he said finally. "Love does not make you afraid. Love does not make you small." His words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt safe with Mitchell. Really safe. Even in his good moments, I was always waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the joke that would remind me how little control I had in my own life. That evening, as we watched the sunset from the small town's beach, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a call from Mitchell. I stared at his name on the screen, feeling my old anxiety start to rise, then made a decision that surprised us both. I turned the phone off and put it in my bag. The 8th day brought a revelation that changed everything. Carlos had introduced me to his sister Elena, who ran a small art gallery in Santa Teresa. As we browsed her collection of local artists' work, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Carlos told me about your situation," she said in careful English, her expression sympathetic. "My friend works at the airline. She says a man came to the counter that day you mentioned, asking to cancel a woman's return ticket. He seemed very pleased with himself. The room spun around me. Mitchell hadn't just abandoned me, he'd actively sabotaged my ability to leave. What I'd assumed was typical Mitchell disorganization was actually calculated cruelty. He'd wanted me stranded, wanted me to panic and beg for his help so he could swoop in and play the hero, while reminding me how helpless I was without him. Carlos saw my face and immediately guided me to a chair. "What is it? What's wrong?" When I explained what Elena had revealed, his expression darkened in a way I'd never seen before. "He canceled your flight? On purpose?" "He wanted me to suffer," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "He wanted me to call him crying and desperate so he could feel powerful." But as the initial shock wore off, something else emerged. A fierce, burning anger that felt clean and pure. For 3 years, I'd made excuses for Mitchell's behavior, convinced myself that his pranks came from a place of playfulness rather than malice. Now I had proof of his true intentions, and it was liberating in the most unexpected way. "I'm not who he thinks I am," I said, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. "He thinks I'm helpless without him. But look at me. I've been navigating a foreign country for over a week. I've made friends, learned new things, discovered parts of myself I'd forgotten existed." Carlos reached for my hand, his touch warm and steadying. "You are much stronger than he knows." That night, I sat in my hotel room staring at my silent phone. Mitchell had left several voicemails, each one more frantic than the last. In the most recent one, his voice was tight with panic. "Sandra, I'm starting to think something happened to you. This has gone way beyond a joke. Please just call me back and let me know you're alive. I'm considering calling the police." The manipulation was so transparent now that I almost laughed. He was trying to flip the script again, making himself the worried husband dealing with an unreasonable wife instead of the man who'd abandoned his spouse in a foreign country. The threat about calling the police was particularly rich. What exactly would he tell them? That his wife wasn't responding to his messages after he'd deliberately stranded her abroad as a prank? I thought about the woman I'd been just 8 days ago, how she would have called him back immediately, apologizing for making him worry and accepting his narrative that she was the problem. That woman felt like a stranger to me now. Instead, I opened my laptop and did something I should have done years ago. I started documenting everything. I wrote down every prank I could remember, every time he'd made me doubt my own perceptions, every instance where he'd twisted my reactions to make me the villain in our relationship. The pattern was undeniable when laid out in black and white. As I typed, I thought about Carlos and the way he looked at me, not like a project to be fixed or a target for his amusement, but like a whole person worthy of respect and kindness. I thought about Elena's warm welcome despite our language barrier, about the vendors who'd treated me with dignity, about the children who'd waved simply because I'd smiled at them. This was what normal human interaction looked like. Mitchell's treatment of me wasn't love with a sense of humor. It was control dressed up as affection. My phone buzzed with another message, but I didn't look at it. I had a plan forming, and for the first time in years, it was entirely my own. The 9th day brought an unexpected gift, absolute clarity. I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years, as if some invisible weight had finally been lifted from my shoulders. Carlos had planned another day of exploration, but first I had something important to do. I called my friend Jennifer back in Portland, calculating the time difference carefully. When she answered, her voice was sharp with worry. "Sandra! Oh my God, where have you been? Mitchell called everyone looking for you. He said you'd gone missing in Brazil and weren't answering your phone. We've all been terrified something happened to you." The fact that Mitchell had reached out to my friends, spinning his narrative of the worried husband dealing with a mysteriously absent wife, should have surprised me. But I was beginning to understand how deep his manipulation ran. By controlling the story, he was setting himself up to be the hero when I finally came crawling back. Jennifer, I said calmly, I need you to know the truth about what happened. I told her everything, about the note, about Mitchell deliberately canceling my return flight, about the pattern of cruel pranks that had been escalating for years. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. That bastard, Jennifer finally whispered. Sandra, I had no idea it was this bad. We all thought, he seemed worried, but now that you're telling me this, he's been calling everyone to establish himself as the victim before I get home and tell my side, I said. He knows exactly what he did. Jennifer was quiet for another moment. What are you going to do? That was the question, wasn't it? I looked out my hotel window at the vibrant streets of Rio, thinking about Carlos waiting downstairs to show me another corner of his beautiful city. I thought about Mitchell back in Portland, probably planning his triumphant rescue story for when I finally broke down and called him. I'm going to let him sweat a little longer, I said. And then I'm going to remind him that actions have consequences. After hanging up with Jennifer, I felt a surge of energy I hadn't experienced in years. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a woman taking control of her own story. Carlos was waiting in the lobby with his usual warm smile and 2 cups of coffee. You look different today, he observed as we walked toward the metro station. Happy. I feel like myself again, I said, and meant it. We spent the day at Tijuca National Park, hiking through rainforest trails that felt worlds away from the chaos of the city. Carlos was an excellent guide, pointing out exotic birds and explaining the ecosystem in his patient, enthusiastic way. But more than that, he was excellent company. Funny without being cruel, confident without being domineering, interested in my thoughts without making me feel like I was being tested. As we sat by a waterfall, sharing a picnic lunch Elena had packed for us, Carlos asked the question I'd been expecting. What happens when you go home? I'd been thinking about that constantly. The practical details were daunting. Finding a divorce lawyer, figuring out how to separate our finances, deciding whether to keep living in Portland or start fresh somewhere else. But underneath all that was a deeper question about what kind of life I wanted to build. I don't know yet, I said honestly. But I know I can't go back to pretending Mitchell's behavior is acceptable. Carlos nodded, his expression serious. You deserve someone who treats you with respect. Always. That evening, as I sat in my hotel room preparing for what would be my final night in Rio, my phone buzzed with another call from Mitchell. This time, I answered it, but I didn't say hello. Instead, I let it ring through to voicemail and listened as his voice, tight with barely controlled panic, filled the silence. Sandra, please. I'm sorry, okay? The prank went too far. Just call me back so we can figure out how to get you home. I'm worried sick about you. I saved the voicemail, then crafted the message that would change everything. On the 10th day, I sent the text that would shatter Mitchell's carefully constructed narrative. Thanks, babe. Carlos showed me some spots you'd never reach. I attached a photo Carlos had taken of me the previous day at the waterfall, sun-kissed and genuinely happy, my arm around his shoulders as we both laughed at something he'd just said. We looked comfortable together, natural, like 2 people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. My phone rang within 30 seconds. What the hell does that mean? Mitchell's voice was sharp with panic. All pretense of the worried husband dropped. Who is Carlos? What spots? Oh, Carlos is a tour guide I met, I said, keeping my voice light and casual. He's been showing me around Rio since you left. Amazing what you can see when someone actually cares about what you want to do. The silence on the other end was deafening. I could practically hear Mitchell's mind racing, trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation. Sandra, this isn't funny anymore, he finally said, his voice taking on that familiar, commanding tone. You need to come home immediately. We need to talk about this. Actually, I think we're talking just fine right now, I replied. You wanted me to figure out how to get home on my own, remember? Well, I'm figuring out a lot of things. It was just a prank, The desperation in his voice was unmistakable now. "You're supposed to be grateful when I rescue you. That's how this works." And there it was. The truth he'd never admitted before. In Mitchell's mind, I was supposed to be grateful for his rescue from a problem he'd created. I was supposed to thank him for solving the crisis he'd engineered, cementing my dependence on him and his superior problem-solving abilities. "The thing is, Mitchell, I didn't need rescuing," I said. "Carlos showed me what partnership actually looks like. You know, where someone considers my feelings instead of treating me like the punchline to their joke." The photo I'd sent was already doing its work. I could hear it in his breathing, in the way his voice cracked slightly when he spoke again. "You can't leave me for some Brazilian guy you just met." "Leave you?" I repeated, as if the idea had just occurred to me. "Mitchell, you left me, in a foreign country, as a joke. You canceled my return flight and left me stranded because you thought it would be funny to watch me panic. How did you—" He caught himself, but it was too late. "How did I know you canceled my flight?" I finished for him. "Because unlike you, Carlos has friends who actually care about people. They told me what really happened." The line went quiet, except for Mitchell's ragged breathing. I could picture him in our Portland apartment, probably pacing the living room, running his hands through his hair the way he did when his carefully laid plans started to unravel. "Sandra, please," he said. And for the first time in our entire relationship, Mitchell sounded genuinely vulnerable. "This has gone too far. I was just trying to... I wanted you to appreciate me more. By abandoning me..." The anger I'd been holding back finally bubbled to the surface. "By making me feel helpless and alone? By hoping I'd call you crying and desperate so you could feel important? That's not... I didn't mean..." "Yes, you did," I cut him off. "You meant every bit of it. Just like you meant every cruel prank you've pulled over the past 3 years. You've been systematically trying to make me feel small and dependent. And you know what? It worked. Until now." I looked out my hotel window at the sunset painting Rio's skyline in shades of gold and pink. In a few hours, I would board my rescheduled flight home, but I wasn't the same woman who'd been abandoned here 10 days ago. "I'm filing for divorce when I get back," I said simply. "Carlos showed me what it feels like to be treated with respect, and I'm never going back to settling for less." "Sandra, wait." I hung up and turned off my phone. Mitchell could panic all he wanted. I was done being his audience. Mitchell's carefully constructed image crumbled when the truth about his hilarious prank spread through their social circle. Friends who had initially sympathized with his story of a missing wife were horrified to learn he had deliberately abandoned Sandra in Brazil and canceled her return flight as a cruel joke. His reputation at Valina Media suffered when colleagues realized his pattern of manipulation extended beyond his marriage, and several clients began questioning his judgment and character. The divorce proceedings became a public embarrassment, as Sandra's documentation of his psychological abuse painted a clear picture of a man who confused cruelty with humor, while his frantic attempts to win her back only highlighted his desperation and loss of control. His family, who had always enabled his behavior by laughing at his pranks, finally saw him for what he truly was, when Sandra calmly presented evidence of years of calculated emotional manipulation, disguised as playful jokes. As I settled into my new apartment in Portland 6 months later, I smiled at the postcard Carlos had sent from Rio, a picture of Sugarloaf Mountain with a simple message: "Thinking of you and hoping you're building the life you deserve." I was doing exactly that, surrounding myself with people who understood that love should lift you up rather than tear you down, and I had never been more grateful for a prank that backfired so spectacularly it set me free.